Welcome to Conversations with Consequences. We are the radio show and podcast of the Catholic Association, where we aim to change the culture one conversation at a time. You can listen to Conversations with Consequences on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network, Saturday mornings at 7 a.m. Eastern, or catch the encore at 5 p.m. We are also on Sirius XM channel 130. Of course, our radio show is also a podcast. Go to thecatholicassociation.org or directly to wherever you listen to your podcast.
I'm your hostess, Mary Fiorito.
And I'm Ashley McGuire.
And we are happy to have Msgr Roger Landry with us. You know him as a regular member of our team that has provided exceptionally thought-provoking homilies at the end of each of our programs. But with his new position and schedule, he's now joining us in person every week to touch base on all the great things he's doing now as National Director of the Pontifical Mission Societies. And we can't really thank you enough, Msgr, for all that you do. You've been terrific to our TCA family as our team chaplain. This week is an important milestone as we mark 5 years since the start of the COVID pandemic. And in many ways, we're still climbing out of that hole that was left behind. So welcome, Msgr Landry.
Great to be with you, Mary. Great to be with you, Ashley. Yes, we are growing out of it. And last month, we saw some promising numbers that basically mass attendance has returned to pre-March 2020 numbers in a lot of the places of the country. And so that's really good news. We had lost a third of the people. The church is opened again, and that is devastating to us, losing 1 out of every 3 of the children of God who should be augmenting our own worship. But thanks be to God, over the course of time and the new stability, many of the people have come back to the Father's house, which is one of the great Lenten themes too.
Yeah, well, praise God. You know what? I'm in Chicago, Father, and so we did not have our obligation restored for about 2 years after the start of the pandemic. And what I noticed in my parish, and it's a very typical Catholic urban parish, we have a big parish school, etc. The older people were all back as soon as they could be. You know, people like my husband and myself with older adult children were back. But the young families did not come back. They virtually vanished.
That's a general rule in the faith, that many of our most faithful people are a little bit higher on the actuarial tables. When in New England, you have massive thunderstorms and likewise big snowstorms. When you open up the church door to 27 inches of snow, you've got the 80-year-old women out there, and you don't have the construction workers with their pickup trucks and their plows generally there. And so we saw that likewise in COVID. Let's give credit where credit is due to those seniors who love the Lord so much that they're always going to be showing on up, even when it requires a little bit of risk and great effort. And like, we want that to be an example for everybody, drawing us backward to the extent that's possible. Because just like there's the widow with her mite in the gospel, who out of her generosity was singled out by the Lord, so sometimes you see that same love that led to that mite shown in showing up for daily mass, even in the midst of a pandemic, even in the midst of a snowstorm, even in the midst of weather or other circumstances that could keep many others away. But what's curious, in New England a lot, not to be cynical, on the days in which people don't come to mass, somehow they're still able to get to the malls and to the supermarkets. We just need to make sure, and we heard it in last Sunday's gospel, that we're trying to help people to hunger for every word that comes from God's mouth, even more than the natural hungers we have for the way that he fills our tables each day.
Right. And that the obligation's there for a reason. I think that's something that's lost on a current generation. And, you know, in part it's because they weren't well catechized, but in part, I think it is, in particular, this generation doesn't accept imposed obligations easily.
That's a good insight. And sometimes even those who did understand the obligations We're understanding them under a perspective of fear that if I don't do this, I could go to hell if I voluntarily miss Sunday Mass, rather than out of love saying, God has come from heaven to this altar in order to meet me and feed me. How could anything short of a loving response be worthy of his own generosity? And so there was a time in which people, because they didn't want everybody motivated by fear, started to downplay the obligation that should always be principally motivated by love. In the same way that even there's not a commandment for us to call our mother on her birthday and say that I love you back to somebody who loves us. So in the response to the Lord, even though there's an obligation, for most of us, we shouldn't need an obligation to get there, but the obligation can't help in the training of our love.
Monsignor, I had a friend who's a priest in Rome, and as we all recall, Italy was, a few weeks ahead of us with the pandemic, and for a while it seemed like maybe this would be something that would be isolated to Italy. Um, and I remember he called me and he said, "You need to go to confession as soon as possible because you may not be able to for a while." And I thought, what? And I was like, okay, if he's telling me I'm going. And so I raced down to the church with my kids. It was Saturday evening and they had just ended it early. And this sounds so melodramatic, but I remember coming out and hearing this crow caw, and I was so spooked out. And the next morning they had essentially quote unquote canceled masses, but it was just such a strange time for the laity. I remember months later, we were driving somewhere, we saw a priest, and I joked, should we kidnap him? So we could say confessions. But what was it like for you as a priest? I mean, the laity, we all remember what it was like, but what was it like for you to not be in contact with the people that you're used to ministering to on a day-to-day basis?
So you're asking me to say on air a few things that I haven't said publicly, but I'll share them because it's 5 years later. I was working for the Holy See at the United Nations at the time. And so the Holy See is extraterritorial property. And so we had a chapel there that I helped to renovate. And um, I was celebrating several masses each day there for lay people who, if they could get to the Holy See's mission, once they were in the Holy See's mission, nobody could enter without the permission of the Holy See. And so
Mm,
masses started at 5 o'clock in the morning, and then I'd do another one at 5:30, another one at 6, as more people were looking to have a chance to be able to come and receive the Lord. But the whole reason why I exist, the whole reason why a priest exists, is to be able to give the sacraments to people. And like the people likewise have a right to the sacraments, but they also have a hunger for the sacraments. And so there was no way I could shut that stuff down. I wanted to do it in a way that wasn't creating disorder. I wanted to do it in a way that wasn't embarrassing anybody. But like I had certain confrontations over the time of COVID by the way certain people would prioritize their obedience. And so some, for example, would prioritize the obedience to the civil law, others to church law, others to, in my opinion, a higher law in terms of what the sacraments mean, how Jesus wants to give. And so, like, I was, in addition to celebrating the masses, receiving a lot of people just coming to receive Holy Communion. They'd watched a virtual mass and they were meeting me in a garden close to where I lived, where I had the Blessed Sacrament with me. And they'd come on up and I'd give them the Lord Jesus. Often, I mean, I would always have my stole on me, and there in the middle of a park, I'd be able to hear a confession because I speak various languages. If they could speak a language that nobody could eavesdrop on, we didn't need to be breathing each other's breath. But it was a time for me in which I was living a little bit what St. Charles Borromeo inspired all the priests to do in 1576 in the terrible plague of Milan, where he was out there with the people, even though he could die, and he challenged the priests of Milan. He said, listen, in the early church, many priests, when they were certain they would die if they celebrated Mass, they'd get arrested and then they'd be given a chance to put a pinch of incense on charcoal. If they didn't, they'd be tortured and murdered publicly. Even when they knew that they would die, they would still do what was their duty as a priest, duty as a Christian. I'm not even saying you're certain to die. You've just got to be willing to risk your life for others so that they're able to receive the Lord Jesus. And he says, I'm risking my life. And if you happen to catch the plague, please recognize that your Archbishop himself will come to anoint you before you meet the Lord Jesus. I'll climb a pile of bodies if I have to get there. And, that has always been something that's deeply inspired me as a priest. Being a priest during COVID in 2020 was nowhere near as dramatic as that, but I did have to take various risks in order to care for people who were sick before we really knew. But listen, at the end of the day, we've all signed up to follow a crucified guy. We've all basically said we're going to deny ourselves, pick up our cross every day, following him to death because we're confident that if we live and die in him, we will live forever. That type of behavior drove me to try to make the sacraments as accessible as possible without embarrassing anybody else. And I have to say, I'm so proud of so many of my brother priests across the country who likewise, with great creativity, trying to play within legitimate lines, were celebrating mass upon mass upon mass when they could only celebrate for 10. We're celebrating masses in parking lots despite the wintry cold. We're hearing confessions literally everywhere that it could be possible. We're going out and anointing whenever it was possible, even taking great risks or great inconveniences when they have to spend more or less an hour just putting the gear on in a hospital in order to be able to get to somebody. But while there's a friend of mine in Germany, sorry for being long-winded today, but there's a friend of mine who is a bishop in Germany, a good bishop in Germany, who is very, very faithful. He said, COVID made good priests better, and COVID made those of us who are lazy, bishops, priests, lay people, etc., COVID made those of us who are lazy even lazier. And so I rejoice that COVID was a time to test my priestly mettle. I remember back the hunger of people to be able to receive the Lord. One of the reasons why I think we're getting so many OCIA candidates during these days, that we're getting so much greater love among the young people for the faith, is because COVID showed just how important God is. When God was taken away, easy access was taken away, that overall people are starting to make up for lost time. It didn't happen immediately. We lost a third of the people, but now we're starting to get it back, and I'm hopeful that we're going to continue to grow more strong.
Well, Monsignor, I'm sure everyone has their COVID horror story, their sacramental COVID horror story. And I had a younger sister who got a very, very acute case of COVID and was in our local Catholic hospital, her neighborhood Catholic hospital, on a ventilator, unconscious. And I called a priest friend who was one of those trained COVID priests, when he put on his beekeeper suit and he went to the hospital, to give her last rites. She wound up not dying, but at the time we did think she was dying, and so she was very acute. He goes to the hospital in his beekeeper suit. He has all the proper documentation, and they would not let him in to anoint her. They would not let him in. And I get very emotional when I think about it. He tried. He called me. He said, "Mary, I'm so sorry. I tried. They wouldn't. I did everything, but they would not. It's very hard for me, as a Catholic, to not feel very resentful towards not the church universally, but that here was a dying person whose family wanted the sacraments for her, and the Catholic hospital wouldn't, using all the proper precautions, wouldn't let them in to be with her at the time when she thought that she was at the hour of death. And I know God would have made adjustments for her, knowing she wanted it. Her family tried to arrange it for her. But do you have, I know many good things came out of COVID, right, that you've just mentioned. But still, I think there's a lot of anger among the Christian community about what happened to us, and old people dying alone, and people not being allowed to have funerals with anyone. My uncle passed away during COVID. We had 7 people were allowed to come to the funeral. Where they came up with 7, I don't know, but 7 could go.
There is a lot of holy anger as a result of some of the decisions that were made. We need to be understanding about those making decisions. One of the things that I observed, I'm a Harvard-trained biochemist. I worked at Mass General Hospital for 4 years. I get science. I'm a bioethicist, you name it. And what was shocking to me is the scientific illiteracy of so many of the people who were making the decisions in government, in the church, in schools, you name it. But a lot of the times they were really vulnerable to pseudoscience and behavioral control, masquerading as if it's a scientific conclusion. So, for example, if there's anybody who knows how to put a host on somebody's tongue, it's a priest who's done it tens of millions of times in his life. And to treat that as the most contagious action of all time is unbelievable to me. What was going on a couple levels. First, we've been living with a practical materialism for a long time, which means we focus on the body, we focus on physical health more than we do on the transcendent and the health of the person's soul. We need to keep those in balance. Both are important, and there certainly would have been ways to be able to meet both needs while minimizing the risk without totally eliminating the risk, but while minimizing the risk. And we needed to make some of those compromises. But many of the people in decision-making positions didn't know enough about germs and how they're passed on and everything else like this, such that they were relying on scientific advisors coming from people who thought hyper cautiousness was a virtue rather than a vice. There's a proper prudence that is a virtue, but like when people are phobic with all these irrational fears, making these calls just in case something bad could happen, that's when we made the decisions that we saw during COVID. Thankfully, many of the churchmen have realized that they went overboard. They were too reliant on the advice that they were getting. They regret the decisions that they made, etc. If I were a bishop at the time, first thing I would have done, a priest is only supposed to celebrate 2 masses each day, with the second mass being for some type of real pastoral emergency. I would have immediately given priests the capacity to celebrate as many masses as possible. If the civil government's saying only 10 people can come to a mass, and I think the 7 number that you had was 10 in the church minus the priest and perhaps 2 others, the organist or somebody else for the mass. But if they're saying only 10 people can come, okay, live stream it and then just give Holy Communion to 10 in waves, or just celebrate 10 masses during the day. Sorry, what else are we going to be doing during that, which would be nearly as valuable if there were a pandemic in which people might be totally fine today and in the ground in 5 days? Why wouldn't we be prioritizing the sacraments that Jesus came into the world to institute? And so that's where there's a lot of remorse and repentance on behalf of those priests in situations where they weren't as generous or courageous as they could have been. Likewise with some of the bishops who have made public statements afterward that they wish that they could have. We're recording this on the day in which there's going to be a new Archbishop of Washington. And God bless Cardinal Gregory, who's departing office today, for having the candor to say that we made some mistakes. I went overboard. Cardinal Dolan in New York has said something similar. And they're 2 of many who have recognized that if another supposed pandemic was coming, that they'd respond with a greater prioritization of the sacraments. Because if we're not saying at a time in which people are dying almost overnight that the sacraments are essential for our being ready to die, then why would people take them seriously?
Mary took the question out of my mouth, which was, how do you deal with anger? And my anger was about my young kids being, out of school. And this was not the church's fault. In fact, this to me is one of the good things that came out of the pandemic for Catholics, which was a renewed understanding of how extraordinary Catholic education and Catholic educators are. And my anger was because our Catholic schools here in the Archdiocese of Washington were ready to open on September 1st with these unbelievable plans. Like our school had a 50-page plan to, which in retrospect, they didn't need almost any of that because everybody in the school got COVID, and everybody else did, but they were just total heroes. There was no vaccine. There was total fear and uncertainty. And these teachers were ready to show up and do their jobs. And then our county at the 11th hour tried to shut them down. And I think it was because they knew that Catholic schools were going to make absolute fools of the public schools who were saying we can't open. So my question is, do you feel like the country has a renewed appreciation of Catholic education? And are we seeing that in enrollment numbers? Because I feel like I get mixed messages about that.
Thank you, Ashley, for the question. In general, Catholic schools shone during that time because they clearly were putting the best interests of the students in its proper place. Whereas there are public school teachers who care for the students very much, but a lot of the public school teachers unions and those making the decisions were not allowing the teachers who wanted to teach their kids in person to be able to return. And so Catholic schools clearly showed that priority. I was the head of 2 different Catholic schools in Massachusetts when I was a pastor, and trying to persuade some parents to send their kids to Catholic schools. A lot of the times they'd say, well, the gym is better at the public school, or the cafeteria, or the science labs, or you name it. Everybody began to realize that there are far more important things than gyms or cafeteria, that it's just really, is my kid going to be, and my kid's future and what's best for my kid going to be the priority? Catholic schools definitely showed that. Lots of Catholic schools have done very well coming out of COVID because of that. The children were transferred into Catholic schools and they've stayed, and so it's helped. Still, at the same time, though, we've got the tectonic plates moving against Catholic schools, that a lot of them have serious funding issues no matter what, that sometimes it's only the parishes with parish schools that are supporting them rather than the entire Catholic Church throughout a diocese throughout the country. We've got the larger issues still facing Catholic schools, and so not every Catholic school is anywhere close to being out of the water. Unfortunately, where I live in New York City, they've had to close a few more schools this year because of the financial considerations that are involved in running it, despite the respect everybody has for Catholic schools. There are some of the financial pressures that can't be overcome just by high approval ratings. And so I'd encourage, if there's one listener to Conversations with Consequences today who might have resources to be able to say, how could I make a really big difference for the church moving ahead? Catholic schools really need your help if you're in that circumstance, ma'am or sir. Please, out of COVID, consolidate some of the good work that God's tried to bring out of that pandemic.
Well, Monsignor, one of the silver linings, I think, was that young couples preparing for marriage, were able to have smaller weddings, smaller, more intimate weddings. I know you married a lot of young couples, and probably during that time. I thought that was a beautiful transformation that focused on the sacrament rather than the reception.
Yeah, and I had about 30 couples waiting. About 20 wanted to be married right away because they were living chastely, no question. And they were prioritizing marriage over having more of their family there, over having that reception. And those words to me in the matrimonial rite never meant more than during COVID. And I'd say to these couples at the beginning of the homily, you're in a few minutes about to say that you're going to be with each other for worse and for sicker. And you're showing it right now, getting married in the midst of the worst pandemic in a century. And so thank you for that witness, because a lot of these Catholic couples were superstars during COVID, prioritizing the most important things and giving us all a witness to emulate.
Well, Monsignor Landry, thank you so much for spending this time with us today. We are grateful for your work. To learn more about Monsignor Roger Landry, please visit CatholicPreaching.com. Monsignor Landry, thank you again.
Great to be with you, Mary and Ashley, and we thank God together that we're far from COVID now. Thanks be to God.
Amen. Thank you, Monsignor.
Welcome back to Conversations with Consequences on EWTN Radio. I'm your host, Mary Fiorito.
And I'm Ashley McGuire.
And I'm Leigh Snead.
And we are happy to have all of you with us today. So ladies, we're in the thick of Lent now and daylight savings time as well. So as if we needed additional penance. Mm-hmm. So it's been very encouraging, as I think it always is, on Ash Wednesday to see how many people, if not coming for the entire Mass, come for ashes. And so many young adults going back to church. There was a New York Times story recently that seems to indicate that the new Pew results show that attrition in churches has stopped and may actually be reversing in some cases. So a lot to talk about today, but let's start with Lent. So what are you ladies doing for Lent and how's it going for you?
Well, I'll start and I'll say that I gave up giving up food or drink for Lent many years ago because I just started to feel like it was like a societal cliche, and it annoyed me that people who don't actually observe Lent or Easter, that's just what they do. That's not, for the people who do it, that's great. It's just, I decided instead of giving up something, and part of it was I've been pregnant 5 times, so I feel like I've gone through so many periods where I've given up alcohol or haven't felt well. So it's like, I'm looking for something a little different. So I've started trying during my Lent to add something in. And this year I'm adding in a daily rosary, and it's been awesome. And I was partially inspired to do that because I've been doing Walking with Purpose, which is a national program that lots of Catholic churches have for women. And we meet once a week, and we've been doing series after series on the mysteries of the rosary. And it's just had me thinking, why don't I pray the rosary more often? And so it's been awesome because I am giving up my time instead of listening to music or, maybe watching more TV or doing something that I would otherwise be not a great use of my time. I'm using it to spend more time with Our Lady.
That's beautiful.
Yeah,
And
that's really good.
Mrs. Snead, what about you?
Well, I started off the week of Ash Wednesday. My husband was out of town for a whole week, so solo parenting felt like a pretty good, crash course into,
Right.
you know,
And sacrifice.
the
Yeah.
sacrifice exactly. So we had, so there was that, and then we usually just kind of do a general thing between the two of us. Like we usually limit alcohol to weekends. You know, kids can have sweets on Sunday. We do try to keep, especially during Lent, that idea that Sundays are a little Easter, and so we try, make sure we have like Sunday lunch or something special that marks a different day of the week rather than the rest of the day. Another thing that we do with the kids is we use these Lent cards that we got from the Catholic company, I think.
Hmm.
And it's my two twins are on the autism spectrum, and for them, sometimes the idea of time is too much or just too complicated to handle. And um, I feel like my main mission in life is just to keep them, loving Jesus and interested in the church and
Right.
things. So these cards are great because it's like little mini assignments for every single day. So some days it's a prayer intention. Sometimes it's doing a kind of a secret chore without being
Right.
asked. And so that for them keeps it up. Me remembering to do that is always a little bit of a problem, but I've sort of accepted at this point in my life that throughout these 40 days, I will be rebooting and rebooting and rebooting. Right now, I'm praying the St. Joseph Adoption Novena, which I usually do every year, but
Okay.
that's what it'll be over soon, and I'll have to pick something
How is that
else.
different from the regular St. Joseph Novena? Is it
I
for
think-
adoption as a specific intention?
Yeah,
Oh.
yeah, it's good. I get a little text message every day to remind me.
Oh,
Yeah.
I have a friend who's going through the adoption process. I should recommend that to her.
And we're going to take a quick break here on Conversations with Consequences. Stay tuned right here on EWTN Radio.
Welcome back to Conversations with Consequences on EWTN Radio. I'm your hostess, Mary Fiorito.
And I'm Ashley McGuire.
I was just listening to Bishop Barron's. I don't listen to him every day, but I do try to listen to his Sunday sermon before I go to Mass on Sunday, just to get, because he's just so brilliant and his Sunday homilies are just fantastic. So I try to listen to that before we go to Mass. And because it was the first Sunday of Lent, he started out by saying, I'm sure, he said, I can tell you from myself personally, the number of times, he said, and I've gone through Lent 60 times now, I get to the end of a Lent and I think that could have gone better. I could have done that better.
Always.
And so to your point, Ashley, the giving up of a particular food or drink, that's, sometimes it seems almost like it's not serious enough, it's not enough. But then I know a lot of people who, particular people who are trying to give up alcohol will say, well, I give myself 3 wild cards and then that I can use on emergencies.
Oh,
And
I
then,
like that.
Of course,
I
we
like it
got,
too.
yes, I like the 3 wild cards. And then, of course, on solemnities, that's also like a little Easter,
Right.
as you pointed out. So St. Joseph's Day and the Feast of the Annunciation are 2 little breaks during Lent most of the time. So this year will be the real test for us, though, because our wedding anniversary falls on Good Friday.
Oh, man.
Yeah, that's the second time this has happened. We got married on Divine Mercy Saturday in 1998. So it's, that's a risk when you get married in the
Yeah.
Easter season of where your anniversary is going to fall. So we'll have to postpone our anniversary celebrations till the following week, which, after 28 years of marriage, it will be 28 years this year, won't be a huge thing. But I think it was our second or third anniversary when it fell on
Oh,
the last
wow.
time.
Well, that's
when
like
it fell
last
on.
year. Remember, Ash Wednesday last year fell on Valentine's Day. And
Yes,
it
I
caused this
remember.
big dilemma for parents. And you know what? We worked it out. I remember my kids, they all go to Catholic schools. They did the celebration the day before. And it was
Right.
like, you just
That was
kind
the
of
stupidest
roll with
argument
the
on Twitter I
punches.
have ever seen. No, do you know what I'm saying? Like, just it's not a major. He's not even a major. I don't think he's on the calendar anymore, is he? Poor Saint Valentine. And it's not a major saint's day. It's not just it's a cultural holiday. Do it the day before. What on earth was all this angst? And then wear red the next day if you must. But for goodness sake, the church isn't going to move. There were actually some conversations I saw online about whether or not the church would dispense people for Ash Wednesday for Valentine's Day.
Well,
Wow.
good thing they didn't, because
Yeah,
that would
no,
have been
this was one
disappointing.
thing that we always hated when I worked for the Archdiocese, particularly when I worked in the Chancellery, when I was Vice Chancellor, because each of us had to take a day, what we called on call. Somebody had to be on call every day, basically for stupid questions. And that's all you did all day long was take, this is before the internet, a lot, some of it at least. And so you had to take people's stupid questions all day long. And when St. Patrick's Day fell on a Friday, we dreaded that more than anything ever in the course of a year's work, because the number of requests for dispensations, and Cardinal George just wouldn't grant them. He just said this, it is not appropriate. You can celebrate the day before, you can celebrate the day after. You can have fish and chips, which is a very Irish meal.
Very Irish.
No one in Ireland eats corned beef and cabbage. Hate to break that to you, but and you would just think people would be aghast, and they would be like, this is just a church coming down on us like a hammer.
Oh man.
And I just remember one time Cardinal George kind of like with his head in his hands going, if people only realized, most people, how strict the Lent disciplines used to be.
Oh yeah.
I have a priest friend who just sent me what used to be in the bulletins, diocesan wide the week before Ash Wednesday. Just kind of the similar things that you see. What are the Lenten obligations to remind people? And now it's like 3, right? Total fast and abstinence on Good Friday and Ash Wednesday, fasting for those between 18 and 59. But other than that, all of your other Lenten disciplines are completely self-imposed. But you should see. I mean, it was the Ash Wednesday, Good Friday fast for the whole 40 days of Lent.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, in the Eastern Rite, I know that friends of mine are Eastern Rite. They eat vegan all Lent.
Yes,
They
I was
give up
just thinking
dairy.
about
They give up
that.
dairy and meat. Yeah.
and meat for the whole time. And
Yeah. That's always been part of their discipline. I think that's very exemplary. And I don't know if any you saw Cardinal Dolan's post, I guess, from his Sirius Radio. He does both like an Instagram post and I'm not sure what the whole social media component of it is, but he talked about being in a cab with a Muslim during Ramadan. This cab driver was a Muslim man, and it was apparently it was an unusually very hot day in New York, and he had some cold water with him, and he offered the cab driver a bottle of his cold water, and the cab driver said, I would love a bottle of that water, but I can't have it.
Wow.
He said, I can't have anything till sundown. He said, but thank you for offering it to me. And Cardinal Dolan said he was so struck by that, how serious this man was about his Ramadan obligations, and perhaps, we as Catholics, I think it would be good for everyone, and maybe not to go back to as strict as it was, but to something a little like maybe, no meat twice a week, for example, or Wednesday and Friday, or
We've done that.
Yeah, one day a week that you would do the Ash Wednesday fasting. Not every day, but you would do it, say, every Wednesday of Lent, and Good Friday you do the no eating between meals. I do think that people would, and people seem to like it. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like
they
even
like the
people who
challenge.
don't practice. It's always so funny to me. They don't go to Mass on Sundays, but they're like abstemious and very particular about not eating meat on a Friday or getting a dispensation. Like they don't care. They don't go to Mass on Sundays. Why do they need it? Why do they care whether or not they have a dispensation? That's a much more serious sin.
And how do they know
right?
that word? Yeah.
And, my friend Bishop Paprocki, who's the Bishop of Springfield in Illinois, there's a Bishop of Springfield in Massachusetts, so you always have to distinguish. But he said, that it's what the canons say about it, what canon law says about it is you must substantially observe the disciplines of Lent, not completely. Substantially. So a one day of eating meat on a Friday is not a sin necessarily if you're making a mental reservation that you will abstain the next day, or you're going to give up alcohol instead of, I remember one time we suggested that, like, well, you can have the corned beef, but just don't drink alcohol. Everybody was like, gosh, we don't want to, it's so funny, just substitute another penance, but it has to be a significant penance. So that's our Lent. I hope your Lents are going as well as ours are, and that it will be a time of drawing closer to Christ for everyone here who's listening. Please visit catholicassociation.org to follow everything that we're doing in radio, on television, and in print, and online, and in our local communities. And it was great to be with you, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks,
Bye.
Mary.
Welcome back to Conversations with Consequences. I'm your hostess, Betsy Fentress, and I'm happy to have alongside me someone who hasn't been on the show for a while, knee-deep in writing her book, All on Infertility. My TCA college, Leigh Snead, is with me today, and she's written extensively not only on fertility, but also adoption. And as an adoptive mother, she knows these issues firsthand on a very personal level. Glad to have you come up for some air today, Leigh.
No, I'm so happy to be here. Yes, I'm getting bored of myself and the writing of the book, so I'm glad to see another face.
Well, Leigh, I really thought of you. You've shared so much of your own journey and experience with infertility, the heartache, the loss, the suffering, but also the joys you've experienced in finding such blessings in adoption. And right now, as you know, the new White House administration has made some pretty promising statements regarding IVF. And what was your response as a woman who has experienced these heartaches of infertility to that announcement?
Well, at first, obviously, there was some disappointment. We've got a Catholic VP, and was surprised that this was one of the first things out of the gate, especially when in the first Trump term, so many pro-life gains were made. Although even, a lot of people who are opposed to abortion do support IVF and access to IVF. And so the pro-life world is a little bit divided there too. But for me, I think that making it easier to access and government pushing to make it more affordable sort of makes it more of a backup plan, or I've got all the time in the world because this is going to be available to me. I don't have to worry about not being able to afford it. And actually, I just discovered this morning that the CDC actually has an online calculator for your success rates. You put in your,
Really?
yes, age, weight, height, infertility diagnosis, whether or not you choose to use like donor eggs or not, and then it calculates your percentage. So like today, if I were to try IVF, 1% chance of success. But I'm 49 years old. So,
Right.
but then I sort of backed it up to when we were seeking answers to why we weren't getting pregnant. And we
Hmm.
had gone to a secular fertility doctor thinking, well, we know what to do. We walk in there with our, little Catholic infertility playbook and we'll be just fine. Oh, and this man could not wait to enroll me, is the word he used, in his IVF program. And I looked, and it's because my chances back then in my 20s were like 60% success rate in the first cycle, and then like a combined like 78% chance with two retrieval cycles. So I'm like, okay, but then it's like I moved it forward to my late 30s, and then you see where it drops off at 49. If you're going to use your own gametes, it's 1%. Oh, but if I did three retrieval cycles, three egg retrievals, I could get it up to 3% chance of success.
Wow.
Anyway, so I just think putting this in, like promoting it as a social good, just re-emphasizes that false promise of IVF equals baby.
So let's go back to that time. So many couples assume that when they get married, they'll be able to have children through natural means. When that doesn't happen, they begin to explore all these different options. So it sounds like as a Catholic, you did understand why the church did not consider this a viable option. But how did you come to know that? Because I truly feel that one of our missions here at TCA is to promote the teachings of the church
Hmm.
in love and compassion. And how did you come to know that so deeply? Because I think there are people who sort of know it, but they feel that they're going for a greater good, and so it's okay.
Right, of course. And we know so many people in our lives, and probably can assume that there are people we don't know, whose lives have been affected in one way or another by IVF. So actually, my husband and I were in a unique position to understand the church's teaching. Um, I didn't really think much about, I guess I knew the term test tube babies, because I remember like it
Right.
was a big deal when that first happened. But we got married right out of college, and that Catholic teaching just didn't seem to play much of a role in our lives
Sure.
until I was trying to decide next steps for myself, and decided, well, it was mostly after reading this book by Dr. Leon Kass called Toward a More Natural Science. It's an
Hmm.
oldie and a really goodie, and that inspired me to want to study philosophy with a concentration in medical and bioethics. At the same time,
Interesting.
Carter, while I
Your
was in
husband.
graduate school, my husband, Carter, right, Carter Snead, he started working for Leon Kass, the man who inspired me to go to graduate school, as his general counsel at President Bush's President's Council for Bioethics. So from that book, Toward a More Natural Science, I had a secular understanding of the like moral recklessness of IVF.
So from a
Leon,
totally secular
yes,
perspective, are
and
there any kind of talking points about that, Leigh?
I think it's like I remember things like inviting a third person into the bedroom.
Mm,
Um, you know, taking out that sort of mysterious stranger element of reproduction, or, you know, really even, I mean, adoption, clearly really a stranger, but, you know, because even, you know, you give birth and you meet this little new, totally unique human being, right? It's,
Right.
you don't know. And this, especially when you add in things like PIGD, I'm sorry, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, when you're weeding out embryos, you know, again, you're making a child a commodity instead of a gift.
Right.
Yes. So then when I went to school at Catholic University in the School of Philosophy, in a medical ethics class, we had what my professor jokingly called Catholic Day, because, you know, we read lots of different authors and writers, but we had one day where we learned what was permissible, you know, and impermissible in terms of, especially with you know, procreation, end of life
Mhm.
things, what the church teaches on those things. And so I was able to combine my faith and whatever I already knew, sort of the secular, you know, problems with IVF together, and understand that, of course, that the teachings, you know, that don't allow for IVF are aligned perfectly well with our total understanding of contraception and human sexuality and the
Mhm.
marital relationship and the procreative and the unitive. And there we had, and then so while my husband was there, he at the council, he was the chief author of the government report called Reproduction and Responsibility. And so again, this was, you know, a government thing, and they had lots of different people, lots of different advocates from different groups, fertility groups, and lots of guest speakers. And I mean, the President's Council on Bioethics was just chock full of like the best people: Marianne Glendon, Robbie George, um, Bill
Wonderful.
Hurlbut from Stanford. I mean, the list
Oh,
goes
he's great.
on. He's
Yeah.
great. Yeah. So all these amazing people. And so Carter was reading. So basically, the year that we were really, well, giving it our all, you know, in terms sort of just like stopped playing Russian roulette, you know, and said like, no,
Well,
we
being
want.
open to life. Yes.
Yes, yes,
Right.
aggressively at this
Yes.
point. That year, Carter was writing this report where basically, with every chapter, he learned something new that could go wrong. You know, it was like, no
Yeah.
stress, you know, although we never found an answer to our infertility.
Oh,
But
really?
no, unexplained.
Hmm.
So yeah, I mean, I think that's where our background lies. I guess it's unusual that both of us would have, you know, had these extra enriching opportunities, and then end up an
Yeah.
infertile couple together, providentially, probably. And
But a
yeah, so
lot of it coming from a secular background. I think that's what's
yeah,
fascinating. I mean,
yeah,
Leon Caswell, he's Jewish, not
hmm,
Catholic, but he's looking at these through a moral lens,
yeah.
from a different faith tradition and coming to the same conclusions, right?
And and he's a physician too. I mean,
Right. Oh,
so he's a
yes.
scientist.
Yes.
Yeah. So all these things, yeah, it's a really compelling thing, and there's not probably enough voices out there like that.
Mhm. Do you
Yeah.
think it's hard to have those conversations, Leigh, with women who are in the same experience that you spent years in? And how do you gently guide them to the path that you have taken and away from this technological solution that has produced a lot of children that, you know, people that we might know and love. I find it hard to start that conversation. I mean, I feel like I know what what the teachings are,
Right.
but to really bring compassion to the forefront. And how do you move that conversation in the direction that you ended up in?
Yeah, I think it's really hard. The compassion bit, I think, oftentimes can hold us back sometimes from
Uh-huh.
delivering the truth. I mean, I think it's a real gift for people who can do both at the same time, be very clear about what the truth is, and for the person on the receiving end to be open to the idea that this person is just trying to love them by telling them the truth and to try to help them get to heaven. So it's tough. And usually, if you're considering IVF, that means you've already been waiting and struggling for a very long time. And if, you know, you're just suggest something like an aura ring, or even just, you know, the Creighton model, Nepro technology, that takes time, because it wants to work in concert with your natural functions, with your natural biological functions, and to try to treat the underlying conditions, which could be so subtle. And there's a lot of kind of, let's just see if this helps
Right.
approaches, especially with unexplained infertility. So I think that the person is usually already very broken and really sad and kind of desperate, and someone's saying, I can do this for you. You don't have to miss out.
Right.
And that's a real temptation. I felt it myself.
I wanted to ask you about
Yeah.
that. Did you ever think like, well,
In weaker moments, you sort of think about it. You think, oh, we'll just implant two embryos. We
right,
will make two, we'll implant two, and then we'll never have to think about this again.
right,
Because it's so private anyway. And I mean, obviously, anything to deal with reproduction and, marital stuff is private. I think a lot of people are ashamed that they can't get pregnant, that you
right.
feel, there's a
So
real,
we
there's
need to
this,
eliminate that shame
hmm
and also have people understand that even if you just create these two embryos, it's tell us why that's a problem. Even if there ends up being no embryos destroyed, I mean, how many people do you think really understand that they're being destroyed,
No,
Leigh?
I don't think so. I don't think so. And I doubt that very many people go into it thinking we'll make extra and we won't destroy them. We'll just donate them.
Right,
I mean, maybe there are some people who think that way, but it's probably only after they do give birth to children and then realize they've got a bunch of more children in the freezer, but they
right.
don't want more children, but then they somehow get this, aha, oh, wow, that was my baby all along.
Hmm.
And that's when the donation happens. I mean, this is all speculative, just sort of trying to get into that headspace and understand what they're feeling.
So it's a destruction of life to
Oh, yes.
create life.
And then it's the separation of the procreative and the unitive.
And don't you think that's really the heart of it? Because you can tell people your child might have, I mean, I've read that there's an increased um, chance that your child might have a birth defect, which then leads people to start doing genetic testing on the embryos,
hmm
right? Can you tell us about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think it used to be an optional thing, but I think now that it's so heavily preferred to get the optimal embryos, that it's kind of de rigueur to do the genetic testing beforehand and screen for certain things. And I think, you have to choose which traits you want to screen for. And I think it can be pretty expensive, but I think there are some basic things that get screened for immediately. Again, I haven't been in the game for a while, in terms of, current
Right.
practices, but yeah, I think that the screening is a real problem. But I think that what it does to the marriage and what you understood consummates a marriage is being completely broken apart. Like
Yes.
the car and sold for parts. It's just like, the procreative is this. I mean, even doctors, fertility doctors use language like, we're going to get you pregnant. It's just, a punch in the face of marriage, and that, especially, well, in a Catholic sense anyway. I think other people probably don't feel about it that way, which is the problem, I suppose.
I'm glad you brought that up because I read a beautiful piece that you wrote and you said this. The day you and your husband say, I do, you are a family, a complete family. Your family may grow with children, and what a blessing they are, but sometimes children don't come. The love you share within your marriage, the life you live together every day, trying to help them get to heaven, and the gifts your family brings to the world through your friendship, prayers, and hospitality, those are good and holy fruits. Now, is that something that you understood kind of in the midst of this, or is that more of a little bit of hindsight of looking back and trying to help other people say, you are complete from the day you get married? I loved reading that.
Yeah, it is something that I've just, anyway, put into words, I think, in the last 10 years. I mean, maybe I
Mm-hmm.
had a strange, vague understanding of it,
Mm-hmm.
but I think it wasn't really until maybe 15 years ago that I really started to understand the sort of thread of work among a lot of women my age that it talks about the feminine genius, in the spirit of JP2. And I also, a lot of fruitful femininity talk. I feel like a lot of the organizations I've come to
Yes.
be involved with, I've been on podcasts talking about fruitful femininity.
What does that, will
And
you kind of tell for those of us who aren't super familiar with that phrase, what does that manifest?
the special gifts that women bring. And I think if you, by embracing what you've been given, and that includes maybe a cross that you need to pick up and carry, that representation, like that witness
Right,
to like the love of our Lord, I think is the seed that, sprouts all this fruit,
right.
in our communities and our families. And I think that there's something that, women who are single feel. I mean, obviously there's just something very special about women. And it's hard when you hear fruit, you think babies. And it's hard to
Right.
feel fruitful. You feel, the word barren, right? I mean, that's what it means. Like, no fruit. But then
Right.
you see babies are not the only fruit.
Yeah.
And I think it's important when you're in a season or a lifetime of infertility to understand what gifts you bring. And I think things like staying married, because a lot of people divorce when dealing with infertility issues.
You have 4 children now.
I do. I do. I know. My friend who's also an adoptive mom and never had any biological children, she also has 4. And we always 8 kids between us, not too bad for a couple of infertile girls. Yeah,
And
it's pretty amazing.
and some of your children came very quickly, right?
Yes.
Can you tell us? Right.
Yeah, sure. Our first was about 6 weeks after we first met with the agency. And we hadn't even decided against about between domestic and international and whatever. But we were young and we were still in our 20s and we weren't done pursuing any sort of help NAPRO technology, but we were done with the secular doctor. We ended up just walking out of the office one day because he was just so aggressive and mean, that really angry that we wouldn't do IVF. So they said, oh, well, 20s, you might decide upon a domestic infant adoption. And we said, oh, okay. But we were still living our little DC Catholic yuppie lives. I don't know if that's a real thing, but, just kind of, bebopping
Yeah.
around and doing our stuff. And we had a couple trips planned. And then all of a sudden we got back from Paris, actually. And we got a call from the agency saying we were in the running. And then all of a sudden it was congratulations, your son was born. And then, so about 6 weeks there. And then our twins, we had done years of NAPRO and whenever pregnant, decided just that we wanted to adopt again, that we really felt like that was our calling to be adoptive parents. And not that we didn't hope for a natural conception, but we weren't going to do the needles and everything anymore. But yeah, so we got a call from the agency saying, oh, we've got your gun check, your FBI check, your criminal history, all the stuff you have to do, so much stuff you have to do. You're good to go. We'll let you know, if any birth mothers have reviewed your profile. Although we have someone expecting twins at the end of the month, do you think we would be open to that? And we're like, oh, sure. That sounds great. And we're thinking, great. Someone already might be interested in us. This is great. Maybe we'll get a placement in this year. And the next day she wanted to speak to us. And then she wanted to have lunch. And then when we got to her to have lunch with her, they were admitting her to the hospital. And the next thing I knew, she was asking me to come into the delivery room with her. And I just kept saying yes. And I think that's the most important part. Your fiat, find your fiat. Just keep saying yes to what God has in store for you.
I have one other final question before we close. What are some do's and don'ts when talking with women on this issue? What do you think are things that help and things that hurt?
I think kind of the endless suggestions can be, especially, if it's someone who has normal fertility, just got married and had babies, saying have you tried this? Have you tried this? Have you tried this? Or have you taken this test? I think that can be a little, because really they probably have,
They already done it,
yeah, they've already done it. I think, just whenever there's anything going wrong with someone, if someone dies or if someone's what, is there anything I can do to help? How are you doing? Keep it simple, keep it light. Just as this is a person, address the person, not the infertility, I guess, is probably a good rule of thumb. But I think any sort of just loving, non-invasive gesture is nice because it is isolating.
Right.
And I think just not being left out of things, but understanding that, maybe your friend doesn't want to go to the baby shower, and that's okay.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But I think including them, letting them be with your kids because they probably, that helps too. Don't go on and on about, obviously you don't have to censor yourself, but to not go on and on. I've been in situations where the only thing women talked about were their birth stories,
Right.
and now I don't care, but when you're in the middle of it, you're just and then also, of course, you're aren't we more interesting than this? But that's another issue altogether.
Well, I think that infertility, adoption are really important conversations with consequences. And you've given us a lot to think about today. We are all rooting for you to get that book finished.
Thank you.
When will it be published, Leigh, if all things go according to Hoyle?
I think into early 2026.
Great.
But yeah, I'm just looking forward to that, crossing that finish line on the manuscript and turning that into Sophia Institute Press. That's where it's going to be published.
Great. Leigh, thanks for coming, and we hope to have you back on the show regularly soon.
I can't wait. Thanks, Betsy.
And we'd like to thank all of our guests and listeners for joining us today. Make sure to follow us on social media, and as always, you go with our prayers.